Just real brief, some housekeeping things. If you're a teacher and getting the credits, we'll have a sign sheet for you at the end. And also we're doing surveys. There's a link down here, and also in the back there's a QR code that you can take a screenshot of, and it'll take you to an online form to give us feedback about the science panels that you've been attending at Comic-Con. And we also have some hand paper forms as well that you can fill out, and there's a drop-off box booth right in front. So this is, it's not that simple, the science of gender, and we're going to briefly introduce ourselves and give you some background knowledge, and then probably dive into some questions and discussion.
Hey everybody, I'm Melissa. I'm a faculty member at Arizona State University. So I've been studying genetics for the last 12, 15 years, and in particular my lab studies sex differences. So you can find me on Twitter at Sex Chromosome Lab, Sex CHR Lab, or go to our lab website if you're interested about how we study a lot of these things.
Hi everyone. I don't know if this is working. Yeah. Okay. My name's Mollie. I'm a PhD student in evolutionary biology at Arizona State University, and I am interested in RNA sequencing, which is similar to DNA sequencing if you've heard of that before. I'm particularly interested in something called sex differential gene expression.
Hi, Kimberly Olney. I am in Dr. Melissa Wilson's lab, and I also look at sex differences in gene expression, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about what that is and what it looks like, and how we are categorizing that in typical healthy variation in human tissue types, so that we can better understand sex differences in human diseases.
I'm Emily. I'm a biology PhD student at ASU. I technically don't directly study sex differences, but there's a movement in general in my field, as I study birds, the field of ornithology, to studying male and female birds more equally, because their biology, like it with humans, are different. And so.
All right, so we prepared just a handful of slides for you all, and then we really want to hear what you all think and what your questions are. Okay, oh yeah, I just want to remind everyone, we have no 18 or over panels this year, so everything should be family friendly. So every question you have, if you have some burning questions and you don't want to explain to my 8-year-old what your question means, then you should just come up afterwards. But that said, I'm pretty blunt with her about everything. So I don't mind talking about gonads or genitalia. I mean, if you get a little squeamish about that, probably this is the panel for you. But that said, I'll moderate, so if I feel like some of the questions are really not appropriate for this group, just so you know, I'm happy to be that bad person. There we go. So the title of the panel is The Science of Gender, and how it's not that simple. And one of the things we want to make clear is that gender is not sex, is not sexual orientation, is not presentation, right? So there's a lot of different aspects that we can look at and study, and my lab in particular studies sex as a biological variable. And this, actually, even sex as a biological variable falls into even more subcategories. So we're interested in genetics, so that's both the chromosomal complement individuals have. So in mammals, like us, XX or XY typically, although 1 in 2,500 people who are assigned female at birth only have a single X chromosome, and 1 in 500 people who are assigned male at birth have 2 X chromosomes and a Y. And on top of that, there's a ton of different genetic variations that can happen, because it's not just your XX or XY that determines the gonads that you have or your genitalia, but it's also all the rest of the interacting genes in your genome. So I know that's not very simple. And then we're interested in genitalia and gametes. So exactly how do you define a phallus or clitoris or labia? And all of those things are actually not quite as simple. So there's clinical cutoffs for whether something should be considered a clitoris or a phallus, but that's completely arbitrary, varies by country. So Whether you're producing different kinds of gametes, though, is actually maybe the one place where we can get a little bit of absolutism. So you can produce functional sperm, non-functional sperm, functional eggs, or non-functional eggs, or none of the above. And that's about as binary as we get anywhere. But I think we would be remiss if we started to define people by whether they're making functional eggs or functional sperm. And at that point, how would you even know? Are you going to start swabbing people? Do I need you to? I don't want to know. And then we actually, on top of that, we layer reproductive hormones. So this is something that's always been fascinating to me. So the X chromosome and the Y chromosome start showing sex differences in gene expression, which is which genes are turned on or off, during development before you have gonads developed. So this is before you have any reproductive hormones. You have XX and XY showing differences in gene expression, and then we layer on top of that development of gonads, and then the gonads produce these hormones, androgens and estrogens. It turns out actually estrogens evolved first, and several millions of years later, androgens evolved. And those then, estrogens and androgens, crosstalk with the rest of the genome to then change gene expression again, right? So I love biology, but it is anything but simple. And oftentimes people will talk about sex as a bimodal, right? But this isn't really fair, right? Because we can think about maybe your XX or XY, and so let's just be like really simple here. XX, XY, sure, that's one bimodal, right? But then you also have your hormones. So are you largely androgen producing or estrogen or progesterone producing? That's another bimodal. And now they're pulling them in different directions. And then you have your gonad development, and that's pulling in different directions. And then we have your population ancestry, and so that's now a fourth dimension. And then we have your environment and who you're around and stress, and now that's a fifth dimension. So when we think about each of us and how we're developing, it's a multi-dimensional space, even if we're just trying to think of these. And so if someone tries to tell you, oh, they're just two bimodal distributions, well, it's not that easy, right? It's not like everyone is just tall or short, right? There's no one cutoff that we would say, these people are objectively tall and these people are objectively short, and everyone falls into only one of those two because we are really compilations of all these things. Okay, and then the one last thing is that I'm now sitting on a panel for the National Institute of Health. So it wasn't until 2014 that the National Institute of Health required you to consider sex as a biological variable. Before that, almost all of the clinical trials were done in one sex, largely males, because we all know women are hysterical. Their concern and the valid, so this is where we're going to get to discussion and how we talk about these things. But it's not, science is not so objective, right? The questions we ask are asked by humans. And at the time, we thought that because of the estrus cycle, women were just, in female mice and female rats and any sort of animal that had a sex difference, that those that had an estrus cycle would have too many variables for us to be able to predict what's going on. But you know what turns out is that we know how much variation there is in the estrus cycle across a month. The levels of testosterone vary more than that in a typical male in a single day. What? Well, I mean, now we can't test anything. But nobody had tested that. From the 1940s until 2014, nobody had even tested it or looked at it, and we just had this common knowledge, right, that we should only be looking at one, and largely we should be looking at males because they're going to have fewer variables, and we're scientists, and we want to be specific and reduce the number of dimensions we're looking at. Well, it's not going to work anymore, and now every institute at the National Institute of Health, every scientist that applies for a grant has to justify why they're not looking at separate sexes. So, for example, if you're largely looking at breast cancer, although men do get breast cancer, it's going to be at a much lower rate, and maybe you want to say, I don't have the power to collect enough patients to be able to determine this. Sure, you just need to justify why you're not. So we're going to consider, collect, characterize, and communicate. And with that, we'll go on to
Hi everyone. I'll talk just real briefly about a little bit about my research, just to give an example of why you should be very careful about any studies that you see on the internet or in the news about sex differences. So one project that I'm working on currently is we're looking at RNA sequencing data of human brain tissue. RNA sequencing is similar in some ways, but also very different to DNA sequencing. Basically, we have a lot of brain samples collected from different regions of the brain from male and female individuals. Those samples are then, we sequence the RNA in those samples, and then I'm attempting to look for consistent differences in RNA expression between males and females. And so I'll just give you an example. So this is looking at the full data set, so all the females and males that I have access to. And I tried 3 different statistical models, and what you'll notice is they all give different results. So they're roughly close to each other, plus or minus a difference in 20 genes. So I guess I can walk through a little bit of the details, but this model, for example, predicts that there are 46 genes downregulated in the males compared to females, but the other one predicts 62, and the final one predicts 48. And then you'll see the same for there's fluctuations in the estimate for how many genes are upregulated in the males compared to the females. So unless you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of statistics, I would be careful about anything that you read or repeat, just because statistically it is possible to manipulate or do this stuff incorrectly. Do you want to ask a question? Yeah.
So can you say that in a less scientific way for people that aren't
I mean, actually, everyone asks really intelligent questions, and I think people are sort of, in a lot of ways, intuitively scientists. But essentially, if I make different assumptions statistically about what's going on, that will lead to slightly different results. So we're somewhat confident because they're roughly close. These different models give approximations that are roughly close to each other, and they're not wildly different. They're not off by thousands, but they're not exact, essentially. Hopefully that made a little more sense.
But exact in what?
They don't all give the exact same predictions. They don't all predict exactly 46
46 what?
genes downregulated males
And
compared to females.
downregulated means?
Downregulated means expressed at a lower level in males compared to females.
Thank you.
And then upregulated would be genes that are expressed at a higher level. In this case, because I set females as baseline, in this case, upregulated means genes expressed at a higher level in males than females. Do you mind if we actually save questions at the end just so we can...
I didn't have a question. I was just saying, so basically what you're saying is watch what you read because you can manipulate the data based on which test you use.
Yeah, or not even necessarily deliberate manipulation. A lot of it is we're still trying to figure out what exactly is the best approach to answer these questions because there are so many variables at play. And then a second example I wanted to give is the effects that different sample sizes can have on results. So in the first example, I did one test, and I'm looking at the full data set I have, so all the females and all the male samples that I have. And we did the exact same statistical test, and yet the difference between if I use the full data set, if I look at all the samples that are available, versus if I only look at maybe 5 females and 5 males, will give pretty radically different predictions. So someone might do this, and then maybe they only bothered to do equal sample sizes, and then maybe it was a really small sample size, and then they publish those results, and then people start citing that and saying, yes, these genes are always differently expressed at exactly this level between exactly these individuals this many of the time. So, too long, didn't read. Summary. Have a healthy amount of skepticism when you read about studies on sex differences in the news. You would need to dig into the methodology and the statistics to be confident in the results.
Well, I was going to talk just a little bit about the physiology of gender, but mostly just going to be open to questions about this general topic. Even though I study birds, I can at least say something about this, but there's a lot of these guys are mostly experts in the genetics side. I mostly study the physiology of birds, and when I look at, there's a lot of natural variation, though, in the differences between males and females. So on the left, there's a graph of testosterone levels in males and females, and you'll see that there's a very large amount of variation especially in the males, but also in the females. And there is even overlap between males and females in the amount of testosterone that can be found in the blood. And the same is true for estradiol, which is a form of estrogen. But they're both of these commonly known as like the sex steroid hormones. But even though we normally associate these hormones with like male hormone versus female hormone, they also have important functions in the body that are not just necessarily focused on like gonadal development. So for example, in females, testosterone is really important for muscle and bone development. That's not just a gonadal hormone. And that's kind of why this natural variation is part of the reason why cases like you might have heard of like the Castor Semenya case recently, saying how she has too much testosterone, but that's a little absurd because like that's more than a little absurd. Because there is so much natural variation that you shouldn't be able to just draw the line at like, here you are no longer a female because your testosterone is too high. Like, that's just crazy. And just as another example of variation, because it's not just the hormones either, it's the way that your body receives, like, because hormones are basically signals that your body sends to make things happen, and the way that other cells can, like, receive these signals are with receptors. So these are just a bunch of receptors for, like, the sex hormones in the brain. And you can see that there are, so these are, the black markings are stained receptors for things like testosterone in the brain in males versus females. But even here you could still see that there's, like, the receptors are still there in females, they're just at a reduced level. But if you have any more questions about natural variation in hormones, all of us could probably answer them.
So real quickly, how many of you know a loved one or friend, family member that has had cancer, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's? Exactly, a lot of you. Now, we've been talking a lot about sex as a biological variable, so this is like the genetic sex, but we're also saying there's tons of variation in the hormones and even in the genetics of it, where someone can be XXY or X0. So why do we make this distinction when we're doing genetic research about genetic males versus genetic females if there's also all this variation that is really hard to take into account when you're looking at your data? Well, part of this is that we see differences in mortality and susceptibility to certain diseases based on the genetic sex of the individual. So if you're female, you're much, much more likely to have breast cancer than males. Males, you know, they can get it, but they're very unlikely to get breast cancer. And this is true for all kinds of cancers. We have males in the yellow bars and females in the red bars in this bar chart. And you can see for cancers, just all cancers lumped together, males are more susceptible. But Alzheimer's, females are nearly twofold more likely to develop Alzheimer's in comparison to males. So that's why we do take this into account when we're doing genetic research, is looking at the sex chromosome complement of the individual. It's just something that I wanted to highlight out. So another more common one is colorblindness. Now, you probably know somebody who's colorblind, and there's different kinds of colorblindness. You can be red-green colorblind. Does anybody know why red-green colorblind occurs more often in males?
Sex line.
Yes, exactly. It's because it's on the X chromosome. Now, females have 2 copies of the X chromosome, so even if they are a carrier to be colorblind, they may not actually show the colorblind, like, lack of not being able to see red-green because they have another X chromosome copy that has a good copy of that gene. Whereas males, they only have a single X chromosome. So if they have that gene that makes them unable to see the red-green color, then they're going to be colorblind. But there's also blue-yellow color blindness, and that occurs equally among males and females, and that's because that's on one of the autosomes. It's not sex-linked. And just really briefly, this gets really complicated, so I'm going back to this gingerbread man, because it's really hard to talk about your friends and family about sex and gender, because at least for me, I feel like they're like, oh, well, it's that simple. It's XX or XY, and it's like, no, it's really complicated. So if you do have that time to sit down with a loved one, you know, take them to this gingerbread and show them the different parts of it, that there's gender identity, gene expression, the biological sex, you know, it's all of these things that play in together. And I also wanted to highlight this book that actually my advisor, Dr. Melissa Wilson, pointed out to us one day. It's a beautiful book. It's about a crayon that is labeled as red, but it can only draw in blue. And it's just really beautiful. I highly recommend it for children, and I loved it, so. And I think we're just gonna have questions and discussion. Yeah.
Okay, so you were talking about the males and females identifying colors. I think we go over the article about how tribes and certain indigenous people can only pick out or have one word for 10 different blues. What does that have to do with their genes? Is that why they can't pick it out, the color? Or what is that?
Oh, I've actually never heard of this before.
Yeah, I know that. So actually, that's a really good segue into the comparison between gender and sex. So when we talk about gender, it's typically how people are presenting and identifying themselves, whereas sex is the underlying genetic and biological basis. What you're talking about is in different cultures, they may have more or fewer specific terms for something. That we don't think has an underlying genetic basis. We think that broadly color vision is similar across human populations, but that in some cultures, you will have a need to distinguish between multiple colors, and in some cultures, there won't be a distinguishing between green and blue.
Right, exactly, like Inuits, they can
And
want
so-
red.
And in the United States, we have very few distinct words for snow, right? But in other cultures, there will be very different ones, and
So
so,
it's environmental.
yeah, I think it's cultural, and similarly, when it comes to gender, the number of ways that we allow people to identify themselves and in what ways are very linked to where someone grew up.
Thank you.
Hi, so for the data on mortality and susceptibility to illnesses like cancer and Alzheimer's, do we know how much of that's hormonally based or how much is genetic at this point, or is that still up in the air?
I think it depends on the disease, and some of it is up in the air because your genes can determine your hormones as well. So it's kind of like this continuous loop that's really just hard to tease apart, but there is research hoping to accomplish that.
So we know a bit for autoimmune diseases, at least. So individuals who are XX have 8 times the rate of most autoimmune diseases as people who are XY. People who are XXY, who develop male genitalia and have, so Klinefelters in particular, you can be XXY and develop female genitalia, but XXY males have the same rates of autoimmune disease as XX typical people. So we do know there's a huge genetic component, at least for autoimmune disease, and if we think that the immune system and that increased surveillance may actually be what's causing reduced rates of cancer in XX individuals, then that's the next thing. Nobody's actually looked at that one yet. Mainly it's been in the autoimmune realm, but we do think X-linked and dosage on the X chromosome is tightly correlated with autoimmune disease and cancer risk.
So you've obviously covered a lot of the biological and kind of empirical genetic side of sex. And so how do you see that side of things, the genetic and kind of physiological and biological side of things, influencing or informing cultural experiences of these things, right? So genders may or may not be based on genitalia or on cultural roles or things like that. So like moving forward, how do you think those can inform each other better? I
know. Super tough question. I personally don't have an answer, so I'm gonna let my other panelists chime in, throwing it out there.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so I guess moving forward, as we look at gender and as gender becomes a bigger issue politically, both here in the US and worldwide, and recognizing that other cultures recognize more than two genders, what place do you see biological genetic research informing existing cultural ideas of gender?
I mean, like the place for these like scientific studies in gender specifically, as opposed to just looking at the biological sex aspects?
Yeah, absolutely.
I see them being misused, rather. I mean, I think people want to know. So there's a strong movement now that was squashed for a little while. So it was common in the let's be blunt, during eugenics, during the whole eugenics movement of genetic determinism, that we could, based on a single genetic loci or multiple genetic loci, predict how someone was going to be and their outcome. And genetic determinism has been disproved time and again. We have alleles, we have variants of genes that lead to increased likelihood of a certain physical manifestation. But that's all that it is. And some of what I think is the coolest research coming out now is seeing the effect of the whole genetic background with that particular, let's say, a risk allele for a disease. So there's known risk alleles for genes like retinal pigmentosa, so slowly going blind, right? And there's a known very high risk factor if you have that particular variant of the gene. And what researchers did is they put it in a bunch of different genetic backgrounds, 100 different genetic backgrounds of flies that also get the exact same disease. And in some of them, 100% of the flies got the disease, and in some of them, none of the flies got it. But they had this risk allele that we would say, we'd swab your cheek, do your test, we'd say you're gonna get it, like, we say you have the BRCA1 allele, go get a double mastectomy and get your uterus removed, right? And yet, this exact risk allele, when put into a different genetic background, had no effect on the flies. We're working with some patients right now. We have a patient who has homozygous BRCA1 mutation. She's 72 years old. She's never gotten breast cancer. It's frustrating because in biology we have things that are typically true, but not 100% predicted. And so what I see is that the government, especially in North Carolina with their bathroom laws and in other places, trying to use what they think is biological reality and not really appreciating all the variation that's there. And so if anything, I would like biologists and geneticists to get more vocal with their state politicians about what we do and what we cannot predict. In the back, way back, and then you.
So just based on that, how do you feel? I've heard some people in the news, whenever they're talking about any like transgender issues that are against them, against transgender people, say it's simple biology or it's simple science. How would you suggest people who are in the science field to kindly correct them?
Well, basically re-highlighting the things that we talked about, that it's not that simple. It's not XX or XY. You have hormones, you have environment, you have self-identity, and it's not that binary. So I think it's not just the scientists, it has to be everyone, that it's a call to action to be like, hey, this is not okay. That's my personal thoughts.
Thank you.
So I have a question. Earlier when you were talking about certain levels of hormones, like such as testosterone versus estrogen, how do you deal in a situation such as people who are diagnosed with PCOS being told they're producing too much testosterone? When we talked about how that isn't really a thing earlier.
Yeah.
That makes any sense.
Well, because it's a natural variation thing, like even having a disease is still natural variation. So I feel like that's still not a valid way to like kick someone out of something because that's not exogenous administration where you're like taking supplements. That's still part of you. Like So I know I would disagree with that.
It could be that there's levels, so people in the United States clinically will determine levels of estrogen or testosterone that are considered pathogenic in one sex or the other. Some of the work that's being done at ASU in our anthropology department is actually looking at subsistence populations. Do you see that?
I was just gonna, well, so I guess kind of adding on to the previous questions, like, so I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm in complete agreement with you, which is that it's a lot more complicated, so stop it, please. Yeah. so my
I feel like
question,
I should take an example from our president. Wrong. Right?
sad.
Oh, God.
So
Like, should I be kind or not, right?
I guess if I was gonna boil down my earlier question, I guess this one is like, so when people get in my face about gender and I tell them it's complicated, like, what are, like, your recommendations on the, I don't know, top 3 things that I can shout biologically that, like, I'm not just talking as a cultural anthropologist hippie type, but I have quote unquote real science. You know? I got molecules behind me too, so. How can we work together better?
Maybe a simple way to summarize is to say there are, at the very least, at least 4 variables. So your genetic sex, your hormones, how you identify personally, and then I'm blinking at something, gonads.
It's not just XX, it's Y.
And all those, at least those 4 things, just the ones I happen to think of off the top of my head, can vary. So there's at least 4 moving pieces here, and there can be overlap for each of those between males and females. So sometimes some females express testosterone at levels comparative to some males. And so it's just looking at all 4 things, there's just no clear cutoff that we could use consistently in really any of those areas except maybe the, but even then not really.
And you can even maybe show them the gingerbread person, like pull up the gingerbread person, because I personally really like it just because of how well it represents everything as a spectrum, and there's more than one spectrum, and you can fall anywhere along any one of those spectra, and what the product is this pattern across all of these different spectra, and that you're not all on one side or the other.
There's a QR code for the gingerbread man, so if you just want a person, if you would like to just save that, it might be a useful resource.
Mm-hmm.
We'll leave it up here. Also, hormones can vary depending on where you're at. I know that there's work being done at ASU with the Chimani people, and they have just, is it really high levels of testosterone?
That's what I was trying to bring up. Yeah, so, as an anthropologist, you could bring up the anthropological work looking at industrialized populations, so like us, and non-industrialized populations. And the levels of testosterone in fully fertile males who have, on average, 10 children are considered pathogenic in the United States because they're so low. You can't observe them. And the levels of estrogen and the estrous cycle in the Chimani women who have 10 to 12 children over their lifespans, bless them, are not viewable when you map them onto people, any industrialized population, regardless of ancestry. And so we as a whole have levels that are just way, way higher. PCOS is super high in industrialized populations, and we think it's both of them that are contributing now. And so we could choose any one of these variables and say, look, not only do they vary broadly across people, but we know there's systematic differences that come with having a more sedentary lifestyle, with having access to nutrition. So we largely aren't starving. Maybe our calories, we can talk about the ways that we're getting them, but compared to the Chimani that are subsistence lifestyle, we have the ability to make more of these hormones. Everyone does. Okay, with the black mic and then up and then here.
Okay, so I know that there's a lot of people that are like, oh, like girls are XX and boys are XY. Would you argue that like the part that makes you masculine is not really that Y chromosome, but specifically the SRY gene? Because I heard that when the alleles cross over and create genetic variation, can mess up an SRY gene can get on an X chromosome, and then there's a Y chromosome that's lacking that gene. So if the X chromosome gets passed down to like a girl, she will get more male typically presenting characteristics, and then if the SRY gene is not on the Y chromosome and that's get passed down, it could make a female presenting person with XY chromosomes. So do you think that that's like another factor?
Yeah, so Sayres syndrome is XY individuals who develop ovaries, and XX with SRY is de la Chapelle. It's 1 in 20,000. And that's individuals who develop testis that have 2 X chromosomes. And those are just the ones that we know that are fairly common. And so SRY is a really important piece of it, but it does interact with. So SRY on the Y chromosome interacts with and turns on or off genes in the whole rest of the genome. So it could be SRY. It could also be one of the downstream genes that we know are involved in sex determination across all humans. So yeah, we could choose one gene and say this gene is a really likely candidate. But nothing works by itself. That's the thing. It's like nothing works by itself. Everything's working in these networks. Cool. And then we're up. And then off.
So I've really 2 questions, but they relate. Have there been studies to look at how sexuality, whether it's expressed as a consequence of hormones or genetic activity within your body, how does that vary with age and stress and other factors? Have there been any studies on that?
Could you repeat the question?
The question was about sexual orientation?
Not
Or
just sexual orientation, but in terms of the levels of chemicals in the body, how they affect you, how your gene expression affects you over your lifetime, over various stress situations, for instance.
maybe we should say sex presentation over your lifespan, and how does the body and environment change over time. So yes, it does, but there's not been really systematic ones. So I told you 2014 is when the NIH said you had to consider sex as a biological variable. 2019, this year, is when they said we had to consider the whole age spectrum. So prior to that, we were not looking at young people, we were not looking at pregnant people, and we're not looking at very old people. And so we just have this kind of narrow view of the timestamp. And so it's literally this year that they put a policy to say, now you have to consider the whole age spectrum. I don't know how we're going to pay for that, right? My grants aren't getting bigger, but it is, yeah, it's exactly that concern. We'd like to see how are we, right? I am not the same as I was 20 years ago, and I probably won't be in the next 20 years. So,
You've had a question for a while.
My question is more, I guess, reflecting on the way that this helps us to look at science, and the idea that science doesn't give us yes or no questions, or answers, even though that's the way we seem to talk about it and believe about it, and that maybe it helps us to understand. So I'm just thinking in terms of teaching how to, that the same issue that affects the way we're looking at sex and gender plagues the way we look at science. When people interpret things, when we see an article in a newspaper, it says this happens, and if you look at the studies, like, yeah, maybe sometimes, or sort of.
how do you all feel about it? I mean, they're all current students, so.
Yeah. There's definitely been a very strong bias to look at a very specific group of people at the exclusion of pretty much everybody else. And then there's a tendency to extrapolate from the results that we looked at, looking at a very small, at a certain group of people, and say, this is true for all people. That's particularly, I think, true when it comes to ancestry. So people will look at genetic data taken from, for example, mostly just Europeans, and then say, this is true for all humans. And then when they go and we look at other populations with different ancestry, we find out that it is not true for all humans. And yeah, I agree. I think there has been a danger of sort of over-extrapolating and sort of thinking of this one group of people as being representative for all of humanity, which just isn't the case.
And there's been a big, like in general, like now, like with the 2014 saying, new policy, like NIH policy, saying that now we gotta look at both sexes, or at least justify why you're not, if you're not. But there was a big article that came out relatively recently, advertising for a book that's gonna really talk a lot about this. How, because for so long now we've just looked at sort of the standard white male as the template for everything, that there are a lot of consequences for doing that, and we're going to have to get a lot, in general, like, science is going to have to get a lot better at making sure that we account for the different ways that, so in one specific example is crash test dummies. So that when they use crash test dummies to test car safety, they're using the standard white male like measurements, and what that means is like different people even have different tendencies to sit, and like with different posture. So there's actually, at least from the male-female perspective, like we do sit a little bit differently. So when you try to take like this, plus we're all different shapes and sizes too, so that alone, there's a lot of variation. So when you try to take the standard white male and stick it in a car and see how it does, like that's not representative of how safe anyone else is going to be. So, and that actually has consequences for your risk factor of getting injured or dying in a car crash. Like if you're not the standard sized white male, you have a much higher risk of being injured or dying in a car crash because of the use of crash test dummies that are just one standard size. So there are a lot of things like that that are really should be addressed.
Thank you. So we love quoting and talking about people with diverse chromosomes, such as the X chromosome or the XXY chromosome, XXY chromosome, and we love them. These people are valid. And we often use those arguments to argue that diversity in both sex and gender identity is valid because of that. This is where some transphobic people that I know would say that those exist, but they're anomalies, that they're not what is supposed to be the case. This is where someone would say, we have 5 fingers, so someone has 6 fingers, that's fine, but that's not representative of how it's supposed to be. They would use that argument to say that non-binary genders aren't valid, and also transgender people aren't valid because of that. How would you respond to that?
I don't know. I actually would think about it. So would having a 6th finger make someone not a human being, right? Like that is one of the things. And then the idea, I think, so genetic determinism is one thing that I think we need to address. And another is the naturalistic fallacy, that because it is natural, it is good. And because it is typical, it is good. And that's not how science is at all, but I think it's an argument that people use. If this thing is observed in nature or observed commonly, then it is the good and natural and right state of things. And so I often don't say, I'll say typical rather than normal or natural, because it's just what's typical, and typical has less baggage than normal. But I do think that then we should then have to say that, because these arguments were used against homosexual individuals, absolutely, to say here's what's natural and normal, but then I'll bring up this population of albatrosses that's 90% female, and they will partner female albatrosses every year. They've been recorded for 18 years taking care of the same egg, and they'll have a sperm donor come in and fertilize the egg, and then they're together. And so, well, now, is that natural? Like, now, do you have to eat your words and tell me that homosexuality is okay because now we observe this? So it's kind of, they're picking and choosing from biology, and I don't yet have the exact right way to say it other than because it is typical does not mean it is superior or better. Those same arguments have been used for why we typically study males instead of females. And then we find out that maybe some of the assumptions were not true for that, right? So different, I mean, I think that's the thing in our lab, is that we study differences, but it's not a hierarchy. And it's not one thing being better than the other. And we have to be really cautious with that, because people will try to take our research and take our results and say that because you observe a difference, one of them must be better. And it's like, sure, is purple better than green? We all know the answer is yes, but but they go very well together.
Yeah, speaking of the naturalistic fallacy, cyanide's natural. produced naturally, it's organic compound, would not recommend eating it. Glasses are unnatural, vaccines are unnatural, pretty much everything about our modern lives are unnatural. Should we eschew all of this now and do what is natural? I don't know. I'm not going to.
You spoke about the wide variance in estrogen and testosterone, and shows there's a very wide swing on both males and females. I was curious if hormonal sensitivity swings equally as wide, much like somebody could be sensitive to caffeine. I assume somebody could also be highly sensitive to testosterone. So would having a high level of testosterone and an equally high sensitivity present differently than the lower sensitivity to testosterone?
These questions are awesome. They're so insightful and good to know that like we're getting across communicating really well, because that's exactly what we were trying to say earlier about it's not just the level, perhaps testosterone and estrogen, for example, it's also all the downstream factors. It's all the receptors that are activated by those hormones. How many of those are you expressing?
Yeah.
How active are those? How strongly do they respond to signals? So there's just so many levels of variation.
Because that's true for a
Great
lot of
question,
things,
yeah.
not even just like these hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Like how you respond to stress also has a lot of variation, where like you have your stress hormones and also your stress receptors. And then your amount of expression of these receptors and production of the hormone are responsible for how much you express stress. And the same applies for testosterone and estrogen, where you have variance in the receptors and variance in the hormone, and those combined, along with, of course, all of the other factors, help determine how you express, at the very least, biological sex, if not gender a little bit.
Then just to reiterate, also what we mentioned earlier, so we talked about people who live in industrialized societies who have access to a lot of calories, eat a lot, and people who do not live in industrial societies and more subsistence level, they go out and collect their food every day and eat whatever they can get. Levels of hormones vary dramatically between those two populations. And so, we also have to consider diet when we start talking about this. So.
And it varies between individuals too. Like using me as an example, my levels of testosterone may just be on average higher than other, females or something. But it's typical for me, and that's just how it's always been. So it's hard to, there aren't these like cutoffs, I guess.
A lot of people were asking about how do you convince people who espouse incorrect scientific ideas about like sex and gender. And one of the things I've seen on this subject, but for the different topic, is vaccinations is another thing where people misrepresent science and scientific consensus. And I've seen a lot of people doing studies on how do you convince like anti-vaxxers to not be anti-vaxxers. And one of the things like I'm seeing people come up a lot is if you've got someone who's mildly anti-vax and you expose them to here's explanation of why vaccines are good, they get more anti-vax. They get more like it convinces them the opposite effect. Do you think those studies are relevant to this conversation as well? That you have to be careful how you present information so that you don't put someone on the defensive and basically cause them to retract into what they believe in their heart.
Yeah, 100%. I think the question about how we could respond kindly to people, I really like that phrasing, because I think scientists already have a pretty poor reputation for communicating, and if you think of the biggest science communicators in our field who are living right now, he's not terribly common anymore, but Richard Dawkins was not a kind communicator, and I don't think convinced people who disagreed with him, right? He was like, F you all, if you don't believe in me, you're an idiot. And I don't see that as an effective communication tool ever. So I think what we could do is actually work with social scientists to think about the ways that we can have open communication about things. I don't know what the right way to do it is, because you're right. The research, if we're going to believe the research, shows presenting data to people is not going to convince them. So the example that we had at a different panel I was on was, I could give all the research in the world to a white supremacist about why there's not hierarchies across people of different population ancestries. It's not going to change their view. They'll find justification, right? So it's what people have ingrained in them, and it's a long process. I don't believe at any one point someone's going to come up to me and tell me, you know that thing that you've been believing and thought your entire life, right? It's wrong, and trust me, I'm a scientist. It's not going to work. And especially if I'm an asshole to them, it's going to work even less. Because now they don't like what I'm saying and they don't like me. But how do we have a sustained conversation about this? And I think it just has to be sustained. And like Kimberly was saying, and it needs to be more than just us. So how do we recruit you all? How do we develop tools that we can all work and use together and just be more decent human beings?
So this is just my personal thoughts, but I think what helps me remember to try and, I guess, be compassionate and think about how other people view this when they're very angry and upset and don't like what I'm saying, is in my mind, I think we would all like to have control, right? We all want to be in control, but unfortunately at the end of the day, we're really only in control of ourselves and how we act and how we respond to new ideas. And I think remembering that helps me maybe put myself in their shoes a little bit and stay kinder. And I suppose, but yeah, it's always a struggle because it's hard to try and see things from the viewpoint, because I know I have to do that if I'm ever going to get across. But I know obviously it can be emotionally and mentally draining. So that's, you also have to take care of yourself. That's the other consideration. But yeah.
I just want to add on that, like another way is like if people don't respond well to data, then you can still present how you feel about something in a slightly more emotional way, and maybe that will have better reach. But sometimes it's hard to tell, but it might be worth trying if you're showing data to your friends and family and they're just like, nope, you're wrong. Then you can maybe try the route of, I like what you said earlier about like the whole like, well, if you have a sixth finger, you're still human. Like if you can just communicate the humanity to the other person and talk more on the level of like two humans talking about emotions, then maybe that will be a little easier to communicate.
There's been a recent push to identify publication bias in scientific findings. Have you guys found any instances of publication bias in your fields of research, and how has it impacted your field?
Yeah, there's nothing on women. Very little. We don't know about heart disease in women. We don't know about most cancers in women. We don't know about, pretty much almost all the Alzheimer's research has been done in men.
Same true in other animals as well. There's almost no research on female song, even though female birds sing too. Like that's not just a male bird thing.
There's trials right now going on at University of Washington in St. Louis because there was a bunch of drugs that were tested in animal models and worked. And so cell culture and then animal models, and then they took them to clinical trial in European men and they failed. And what they've been doing now is going back and testing all of those in XX cell lines and in XX animals, and then about 20% of the cases they're working. These are for glioblastomas. So this is one of the most aggressive brain tumors, and it's literally because we didn't even try. And so it's like the field. The field is biased, and we need to work on it.
I just wanted to follow up on that. Also, when it comes to especially medical health, transgender people, criminally understudied. There's like almost nothing out there.
Now they want to make sure you don't get health care.
Yeah.
in the back, and then over here.
Regarding the bird sex chromosomes, are the W and Z good analogs for X and Y?
Awesome questions. It's a really good question, and no, they're independently derived, actually. So,
Do they have the loci for similar acting genes?
yeah, it turns out no, they're totally independently derived. And so sex chromosomes arose independently in many species. And so the ZW, there's one gene on there that's conserved, well, actually, those genes are conserved on our non-sex chromosomes. So the genes on the, if you don't know, in birds, females have a large Z and a small W, just like our large X and small Y chromosome. And that W and Z came from a pair of non-sex chromosomes that changed over time, just like ours did, but they did it independently. So that chromosome exists in 2 copies in us, in every single person. And one of the genes on it is DMRT1, which is their sex-determining gene. But it's one of those that I was telling you about is in the downstream pathway for us. So SRY is one of our first ones, and DMRT1 is one of our downstream. And in birds, it's their first one. It's their version of SRY. But other than that, it's not terribly useful for sex determination, but may be useful for other things.
So in terms of parallel development, why is sex, for want of a better word, so desirable in nature? Why is it so often chosen by a species as a technique for ensuring long-term health or whatever, survival? Do you have sort of a good handle on why we have them at all?
Yeah. So sex, you get 1 copy from your mom and 1 copy from your dad, and your chromosomes will recombine, and you will have your own natural mutations as well, but this recombination helps to eliminate these negative mutations that can arise within the population that are just naturally occurring. So that's why sex has arose multiple times independently in individual taxa for that genetic beneficial reason of the recombination of chromosomes, and that's why we see sex.
There seems to be such a difference in the technique. I mean, basically, you have a limited number of eggs that are produced by a female, men are producing sperm left, right, and center. And at the end of the day, it's just a delivery of chromosomes. It seems to me, why would you have such a different technique? I mean, why wouldn't you just have like 2 almost like females getting together, they put like 2 eggy bits together?
There's species like that. So there's parthenogenic lizards here, the quicktails, you can go out and see, and they're a triploid species. And there are species that have isogametes, where everybody makes the same kind of gamete and you can swap with different individuals. But recombination, the ability to swap DNA and get rid of the harmful mutations is thought to be one of the drivers of having sex, but it's still something that people study. So there's actually a whole 5-day conference in Portland, Oregon this summer on sexual and asexual reproduction. Why are there some species that are always asexual? Why do we get sexually reproducing populations? Why do we get, there's populations that have very large eggs and many small sperm. There's some that there's a species of Drosophila, a fruit fly, and I'll Google it right when we're done. The males produce 1 sperm. It's Drosophila bifurca, and it is super long. So if it were coming from a human, it would be about 6 feet tall, relative to the sperm, relative to the individual. And it's 1 sperm, and it fits, but what it does, so our sperm in mammals compete. There's a lot of sperm competition, but not in these guys. It's just 1 sperm, and it fills up the entire female reproductive tract, and it's the 1 sperm that gets to fertilize that egg. So like, we get biased by ourselves a little bit. So yeah, that would be. I mean, it's still all ages, right? It's biology. It's super cool.
Yeah, so earlier you were kind of talking about how just off the top of your head you could think of 4 different, like the hormones, genetics, self-identification, and gonads. And it seems like a lot of people that kind of fall into the mindset of there are only 2 genders, kind of take the genitals aspect and say that that's the only thing that matters, right? And I was wondering about your thoughts on like, if you find that maybe one of those factors is maybe more important than the others, say for example, a person who has female genitalia, higher estrogen, and all this other stuff, most like female leaning things, but identifies as like a transgender man, would you then disregard the self-identification because all this other stuff is kind of higher, or do you feel like maybe that's like the most important and then the others fall in line after, or do you have like a kind of like hierarchy with that kind of stuff?
100% believe people, right? I mean, number one is believe people. I don't know what else. You all don't know what's in my mind, thank goodness, and I don't know what's in yours, right? But after that, I would say it depends on what you're interested in, right? So if I, as a researcher, am doing a study and I want to say, in trans individuals, how important is the level of testosterone for risk of X? Well, then I'm going to look at that. How important is the interaction between the sex chromosome complement they have with the level of hormones for the risk of Y? Then I'll look at that. But I would really hesitate, and I guess maybe that would be my take home, is that we are going to be able to say these are broadly typical things that are observed between males and females. Those don't always map onto women and men. And I'm not in a place to say what is the most important.
And from the perspective of doing social science research, because I've actually done a little bit of that, as I've done a little bit of biology education research as well. And for those types of like research projects where you do like surveys asking like what people identify as, like male, female, other, that sort of thing, I feel like the self-identification part is the most important there, just because like we're interested in what you identify as, and then the other stuff doesn't matter as much.
Yeah, I was gonna yes and onto that. So I mean, you know, looking culturally across and talking about like what is typical, what's atypical, looking across the globe and in different centuries, but to this day, there are cultures that recognize up to 5 officially recognized genders. Those don't necessarily have anything to do with XY, XXY, intersex, genital formation. It's entirely cultural and entirely personal, right? And so, and people want to talk about like, oh, it's an aberration. It's like, well, but we see it on literally every continent that has people. And we see similarities in 3rd or 4th genders. We see differences in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th genders. So, it sounds like we can't make this determinism about binaries to begin with, but also like trying to tie it just to biology.
I think that's a good place for us to end, because we're 2 minutes over and they're going to hook us off of this stage. But we'll be here for a little bit, and thank you all for coming.
Teachers, questions?